The Duke of Fenbridge returned on a Tuesday, a full week before he was expected. The sound of his carriage on the gravel drive was a sharp, grating surprise, a disruption to the house's funereal quiet. Grace was in her sitting room, the one at the far end of the west wing, when she heard the heavy front doors groan open. She froze, a half-folded shawl in her hands. In 5 years, he had never come home early. His life, like his correspondence, was a model of precision and predictability. She stood, her heart a sudden frantic drum against her ribs. By the door of her room stood a single, sturdy trunk, its leather straps buckled, its brass corners gleaming dully in the thin afternoon light. On the mantelpiece, propped against a cold marble clock, was a letter. Her letter. She walked from her wing down the long, echoing gallery, her soft slippers making no sound on the polished oak. The air was cold, smelling of beeswax and old stone. The permanent scent of Fenbridge Hall. She saw him in the great hall below, a tall, severe figure pulling off his riding gloves. His greatcoat was dark with rain, his shoulders immense. He handed the coat and gloves to a startled footman without a word, his movements economical and sharp. His gaze swept the hall, a hawk's survey of its territory, and then it lifted, finding her standing at the top of the grand staircase. For a moment, they were perfectly still, two figures in a vast, silent tableau. He was as she always remembered him, his face carved from hard angles, his dark hair showing no sign of gray, his eyes a shade of winter sky that promised nothing. He did not wait for her to descend. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his boots ringing on the stone. He stopped a few steps below her, forcing her to look down. It was the first time she had ever felt he used his height to his advantage. "You were not expecting me," he said. It was not a question. His voice was as she remembered it, a low baritone with no warmth in it, the sound of gravel settling. "No, Your Grace," she replied, her own voice steady. "Welcome home." He ignored the pleasantry. His eyes held hers, and she felt a familiar, dispassionate scrutiny, the way a man might inspect a column in a ledger for signs of falsehood. But tonight, there was something else there. A flicker of something raw and unsettled. "Mrs. Gable informed me your trunk is packed." Grace inclined her head, a small, formal movement. "It is. And there is a letter. On the mantel in my sitting room. It explains everything." "Does it?" He took the final steps until he stood level with her. He was close enough that she could feel the chill of the outdoors still clinging to his clothes. "Explain it to me now." She held his gaze, refusing to be cowed. For 5 years, she had honored their agreement to the letter. She had been the perfect, invisible Duchess of Fenbridge. She had managed his household with scrupulous efficiency, demanded nothing, and kept to her own wing. She had given him the one thing he had asked for, a complete and total absence of emotional complication. Her departure was merely the final, logical step in that arrangement. "The terms of our agreement were for a period of 5 years, to secure the succession of the title through a legitimate, if unconsummated, marriage. The 5 years concluded last Thursday. I have upheld my end of the contract. I am now leaving." He looked at her, his expression unreadable, a mask of aristocratic control. He seemed to be processing her words not as a wife's farewell, but as a solicitor's argument. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. He turned and walked past her, down the gallery toward her rooms. She followed, her composure beginning to fray. He entered her sitting room and stood before the fireplace. He saw the trunk, then his eyes went to the letter. He reached out, his long fingers closing around the folded paper. He did not open it. He held it, his knuckles white. "I have made arrangements for a modest cottage in Devon," she said, her voice quiet in the tense room. "I will not be a burden on you any further. The household accounts are in perfect order. Mrs. Gable has the books." He turned from the fireplace to face her, the letter still clenched in his hand. The fading light from the tall window caught the hard lines of his face, throwing his cheekbones into sharp relief. "The terms," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "are no longer sufficient. If you love stories of quiet strength and unexpected love, be sure to subscribe for more. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as this story is just beginning." 5 years before that chilly evening in the hall, Grace Ward had lived in a different kind of prison, one upholstered in faded silks and smelling of decay. Her home, Ward Manor, had once been a place of modest comfort, but under her father's stewardship, it had crumbled. Baron Ward was a man whose charm was exceeded only by his foolishness at the card table. He had gambled away his wife's dowry, then the estate's profits, and finally the land itself, parcel by parcel. Grace, with her quiet intelligence and knack for numbers, was the one who managed the decline. From the age of 16, she had been the estate's unpaid, unacknowledged steward. It was Grace who balanced the dwindling household accounts, who placated anxious tenants, and who stretched a single joint of beef to feed a family for 3 days. Her stepmother, a woman whose beauty had curdled into bitterness, saw Grace's competence not as a virtue, but as a reproach. Lady Ward and her 2 vapid daughters, Penelope and Beatrice, drifted through the decaying manor like pale, useless ghosts, their days filled with complaints about the quality of the tea and the plainness of their gowns. One afternoon, Grace was in her father's study, the ledger open before her, a frown of concentration on her face. She was trying to find a way to pay the blacksmith without forgoing the seed order for the spring planting. Her stepsisters lounged in the doorway, their laughter like the tinkling of cheap glass. "Look at her," Penelope sneered. "Gracie Greymouse counting her little beans. Do you think if you count them hard enough, they'll turn into sovereigns?" Beatrice giggled. "She'll have wrinkles before she's 20. No wonder Mr. Croft is taking so long to set a date." Mr. Croft, Julian, her fiancé. He was handsome, charming, and the heir to a neighboring estate. Their engagement had been the one bright spot in her life, a promise of escape. But as her family's fortunes sank, so did Julian's ardor. His visits became less frequent, his letters shorter. Grace knew why. The dowry her father had promised was gone, a phantom figure in a ledger full of debts. The final betrayal came not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating conversation in the drawing room. Her father, his face florid and sweating, could not meet her eyes. Lady Ward, however, looked at her with undisguised triumph. "Mr. Croft has withdrawn his suit," she announced, her voice crisp. "His father feels the connection is no longer advantageous." Grace felt the floor drop away beneath her, but the true horror was yet to come. Her father cleared his throat. "Grace, my dear, a solution has presented itself, an opportunity to settle all our accounts and secure your future." The Duke of Fenbridge, a man of immense wealth and fearsome reputation, required a wife. He was a recluse, a man scarred by some past tragedy who had not been seen in society for a decade. He needed a duchess to satisfy the terms of an entail, but he did not want a wife in any traditional sense. He had offered to absorb all of the Ward family's debts, including the significant sum owed to the Croft family, in exchange for Grace's hand. "It is a marriage of convenience, of course," her father mumbled, staring at his boots. "A contract. He will provide for you handsomely." Grace looked from her father's shame to her stepmother's cruel smile. She had not been courted. She had been sold. Her skills, her loyalty, her years of tireless work for her family had earned her nothing but the status of a commodity to be traded for their survival. The only person who showed her any kindness was Eliza, a young housemaid. That night, as Grace packed a small trunk with her few plain dresses and books, Eliza slipped into the room, her eyes full of tears. "It's not right, Miss Grace," she whispered, folding a woolen shawl with trembling hands. "After all you've done." Grace placed a hand on the girl's arm, her own eyes dry. She had no tears left. "It is a kind of freedom, Eliza," she said, the words tasting like ash. "He cannot be worse than what I am leaving." She did not know then how true or how false those words would prove to be. The carriage ride to Fenbridge Hall was long and silent, taking her deeper into a landscape of stark, windswept moors. The house appeared suddenly, a great gray beast of a building hunkered down against the bruised sky. It was not a home. It was a fortress, all stone and slate and narrow, leaded windows that looked like suspicious eyes. There were no welcoming lights, no sign of life save a thin curl of smoke from a single chimney. As she stepped down from the carriage, the wind whipped at her cloak, cold and sharp. The heavy oak door was opened by a butler who looked as ancient and unyielding as the stone walls around him. He led her into the great hall, a cavernous space where her footsteps echoed like gunshots. A woman stood waiting at the base of the staircase, ramrod straight, dressed in severe black bombazine. Her gray hair was pulled back so tightly, it seemed to pull the skin of her face taut. "I am Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice devoid of inflection. "The housekeeper. His Grace is expecting you in the study." She gave Grace a single, comprehensive look, taking in her simple traveling dress and worn gloves. Grace saw no welcome in her eyes, only judgment held in reserve. Mrs. Gable led her through a series of cold, silent corridors, their path lit by branching candelabras that threw long, dancing shadows. The air was still and smelled of cold stone, beeswax, and something else, the faint, dry scent of disuse. They arrived at a heavy mahogany door. Mrs. Gable knocked once, a sharp rap, then opened it and stepped aside. "Miss Ward, Your Grace." The study was the only warm room she had seen. A large fire blazed in the hearth, casting a warm glow on thousands of leather-bound books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Seated behind a massive desk was the Duke of Fenbridge. He rose as she entered. He was taller than she had expected, and leaner. He was not the monster rumor had painted him to be, but he was formidable. His face was all sharp planes and angles, his expression severe, his eyes a startlingly pale gray. He wore a simple black coat, the severity of which only emphasized the sense of coiled power about him. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Miss Ward, please." Grace sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He sat as well, and for a long moment, he simply studied her, his gaze direct and unnervingly perceptive. "I trust your journey was not unduly arduous," he said, his voice a low, formal rumble. "It was not, Your Grace." "Good." He folded his hands on the desk. There was no preamble, no attempt at social grace. He went directly to business. "I believe your father has explained the nature of our arrangement. I wish to reiterate its terms, so there are no misunderstandings between us." He spoke as if dictating a contract to a clerk. "You will be the Duchess of Fenbridge. You will have your own apartments in the west wing of this house. An allowance will be provided for your personal use, and you will be given full authority over the household accounts, which I am told are your area of expertise. You will want for nothing in terms of material comfort or safety." He paused, his pale eyes pinning her. "In return, I require very little. Your presence here fulfills a legal necessity. We will lead separate lives. We will take our meals separately, unless occasion demands otherwise. We will not be expected to provide companionship for one another. Your duties as Duchess will be nominal. I do not entertain. I do not go into society. This house will be your domain. The rest of the estate, and my own life, will be mine." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "To be clear, this will be a marriage in name and in name only. I offer you my name, my protection, and my fortune. I do not offer you myself. Are these terms acceptable?" Grace looked at the man before her. He was cold, yes, but he was also honest. There was no pretense, no false sentiment. He was offering her a cage, but it was a gilded one, and its bars were visible and clearly defined. After the suffocating, cloying cruelty of her family, this cold indifference felt like a clean, sharp wind. It was survivable. "The terms are acceptable, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and firm. He gave a single, decisive nod, as if a price had been agreed upon. "Very well. From this moment, you are the Duchess of Fenbridge. Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms." The first year at Fenbridge Hall passed in a blur of gray monotony. Grace's life fell into a quiet, predictable rhythm, governed by the chiming of the long-case clock in the hall and the changing of the light across the moors. She rose early, took her breakfast of tea and toast on a tray in her sitting room, and then set to work. She did not see the Duke. He kept to his wing of the house, taking his meals in his study and spending his days, she assumed, managing the vast and complex affairs of his estate. Their separate lives were so perfectly maintained that she sometimes wondered if he was there at all, or if he was merely a ghost who haunted the account books she now controlled. Her first act as Duchess was to request the household ledgers. The estate steward, a shifty man named Thorne with eyes that never quite met hers, presented them with a dismissive air, clearly believing her a decorative fool. Grace spent a week poring over them in her sitting room, her mind sharp and focused. The numbers told a story of neglect and petty theft, inflated prices from favored suppliers, wages for non-existent staff, repairs that were billed but never made. It was the same pattern of slow decay she had managed at her father's home, only on a much grander scale. Methodically, she began to set things right. She summoned the local merchants one by one, her manner polite but firm, and renegotiated every supply contract. She dismissed the phantom grooms and phantom maids from the payroll. She cross-referenced invoices with the head gardener and the stable master, exposing Thorne's schemes. The staff, who had initially regarded her with the same suspicion as Mrs. Gable, began to change. They saw that her orders were sensible, her management fair. The quality of the food in the servants' hall improved. Their wages were paid on time. Mrs. Gable's severe expression began to soften at the edges. She would occasionally offer a piece of unsolicited advice on a new linen supplier, or a small observation about the weather, small tokens of a thaw. A young maid named Clara, assigned to be her personal attendant, became a source of quiet companionship. Clara's gift was a comfortable silence, an ability to be present without being intrusive, and her loyalty to Grace became absolute. It was during her exploration of the grounds that she found the garden. Tucked away behind the east wing, shielded by a high stone wall, was a neglected rose garden. It must have been beautiful once. The ghosts of formal beds were still visible, but they were choked with weeds, The climbing roses had pulled away from the crumbling trellises, their thorny arms reaching out like desperate beggars. It was a place of profound sadness, a perfect metaphor for the house itself. Grace, who had always found solace in making things grow, decided to reclaim it. She enlisted the help of the elderly head gardener, a man named MacLeod, whose hands were as gnarled as the old rose roots. Together, they began the slow, arduous work of restoration. They cleared the weeds, pruned the dead wood, and turned the soil. She was often aware of being watched. Sometimes, looking up from her work in the garden, she would see him, a tall, dark figure at a window in the east wing. Other times, she would feel a presence in the long gallery overlooking the great hall and glance up to see the Duke, standing in the shadows, his face unreadable. He never spoke, never acknowledged her work, but he was always there, an observer in his own home. The library became their accidental meeting ground. Plagued by sleeplessness, Grace would often retreat there late at night, seeking refuge in the quiet and the endless rows of books. More often than not, she would find him there before her, a book open in his lap, a glass of brandy on the table beside him, his gaze fixed on the fire. He would nod to her, a small, formal acknowledgement, and she would take a seat on the opposite side of the hearth. They would sit for hours in a shared, profound silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of a turning page. It was not companionship, not yet, but it was a kind of coexistence, a slow, unconscious weaving together of their solitary orbits. The discovery happened on a rainy afternoon in her 3rd year at Fenbridge. Grace had made the library her own, not just as a place of refuge, but as the administrative heart of the household. She was undertaking a full reorganization of the estate archives, a chaotic collection of documents stretching back centuries that Mr. Thorne had allowed to gather dust in a remote corner of the room. She was searching for old planting journals, hoping to find a diagram of the original rose garden layout. Behind a stack of crumbling ledgers bound in water-stained calfskin, her fingers brushed against something hard and flat, a locked leather portfolio. It was newer than the surrounding documents, its leather still dark and supple. There was no label. Curiosity, a feeling she had long suppressed, stirred within her. After a brief search, she found a small, ornate iron key in a forgotten drawer of the library desk. It fit the lock. With a soft click, the portfolio opened. The documents inside were not planting journals. They were financial records, solicitors' letters, and copies of debt instruments, all dated from the months just before her marriage. Her own name was on the first page. With a growing sense of dread, she began to read. The papers laid out in stark black and white, the precise mechanics of her family's ruin. She saw the full extent of her father's gambling debts, the mortgages on their land, the desperate loans. But there was more. The Duke of Fenbridge's name began to appear. He had not, as her father had claimed, simply offered a generous settlement. He had systematically, ruthlessly, bought up every one of her father's debts from his various creditors. The final, damning piece of evidence was a copy of a letter. It was from Alistair, the Duke, to the solicitors representing the Croft family. He had purchased the substantial debt her father owed them, and the letter was a formal notice of his intention to call it in immediately, an act that would have bankrupted both the Wards and the Crofts. The implication was clear. It was this financial threat that had forced Julian's father to break the engagement. Alistair had not just rescued her from the consequences of her father's folly. He had engineered the final collapse. He had cleared the field. He had manufactured the crisis to which he was the only solution. The blood drained from her face. The quiet sanctuary she had built for herself at Fenbridge suddenly felt like the most elaborate cage of all. The cold, transactional honesty of their arrangement was a lie. He had manipulated her life long before she had ever set foot in his house. Her presence here was not a matter of convenience. It was the result of a calculated acquisition. He had purchased her as surely as he had purchased the debt instruments in this portfolio. A cold, hard anger, an emotion she had not allowed herself to feel in years, rose in her chest. She closed the portfolio, the sound of the latch clicking shut unnaturally loud in the silent library. She stood, the leather case held tightly in her hands, and walked out of the room, her purpose clear and sharp. She would not wait. She would not retreat to her wing. She went directly to the east wing, to the door of his study, a part of the house she had never entered. She knocked once, hard, and entered without waiting for a reply. He was at his desk, a pen in his hand, and he looked up in surprise. It was the first time she had ever seen him look anything other than perfectly controlled. She walked to the desk and placed the portfolio on the polished wood between them. "I require an explanation," she said, her voice shaking with a cold fury she did not try to conceal. He looked from her face to the portfolio, and a flicker of something, resignation perhaps, passed through his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, his expression settling back into its familiar guarded mask. He did not feign ignorance. "I see you have been organizing the archives." "I have been discovering the truth," she countered, her voice low. "You did not simply settle my father's debts. You bought them. You forced Julian Croft to abandon me. You orchestrated the entire situation that brought me here." He did not deny it. He held her gaze, his own unwavering. "I did." The calm admission was more infuriating than any lie. "Why?" she demanded. "Was it some cruel game? To see how easily a family could be broken, a woman brought to heel?" "It was not a game," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It was a solution. My solicitors in London had handled some minor business for your father. They were aware of his financial state, and they were also aware of your role in managing what little was left. They spoke of your competence, your intelligence. I, as you know, had a need for a Duchess. Not a simpering debutante, but a partner capable of managing a great house. A woman of substance." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "I also made inquiries into Mr. Croft. He was a fortune hunter, a man of weak character who would have made you miserable while he spent your inheritance, had you possessed one. Your father, in his desperation, was days away from promising you to a man 3 times your age with a reputation for cruelty. I assessed the situation and acted to prevent a greater tragedy, and, in the process, to secure an asset I required." His words were cold, pragmatic, infuriatingly logical. He spoke of her as a strategic acquisition. "An asset," she repeated, the word tasting like poison. "That is what I am to you." "You are the most competent person I have ever met," he stated, as if it were a simple, observable fact. "I did not orchestrate your family's ruin, Grace. That was your father's doing. I merely intercepted its final, most disastrous stage." It was not an apology. It was a justification, delivered with the chilling precision of a general explaining a battlefield tactic. A fragile, tentative trust she hadn't even realized she was building shattered. Before she could respond, the butler appeared at the door, his expression flustered. "Your Grace, a visitor. A Mr. Julian Croft. He insists on seeing the Duchess." Grace's blood ran cold. "Julian, here, now." Alistair's gaze sharpened, his focus shifting from Grace to the door. "Show him into the morning room," he said calmly. "Inform him the Duchess will be with him shortly." He rose from his desk. It seems the past is not content to remain in the archives. Julian Croft was as handsome as she remembered, but 5 years had softened him, blurring the clean lines of his youth into a fleshy complacency. He stood by the window of the morning room, striking a pose of romantic melancholy. He turned as Grace entered, his face lighting up with a practiced expression of delighted concern. "Grace, my dearest Grace, I had to come. I have been so worried. I hear tales of your life here, buried in this mausoleum with that brute. I have come to take you away." He moved toward her, his hands outstretched. Grace stood her ground, her hands clasped before her. The anger she had felt toward Alistair was now a cold, clear shield. "There is nothing to worry about, Julian, and I am not in need of rescue." "Nonsense," he scoffed, his charm beginning to fray at her cool reception. "You are a prisoner here. Everyone knows it. He keeps you locked away. It is a loveless, wretched arrangement. I was a fool to let you go. My father forced my hand. You must know that. But I am my own man now. Come away with me. We can go to Italy, to France." His words were interrupted by the quiet opening of the door. Alistair entered the room. He did not stride or glower. He simply appeared, a tall, silent pillar of dark wool, and stood beside Grace. His presence filled the room, sucking the air from it. Julian took an involuntary step back. "Fenbridge," he stammered. Alistair did not acknowledge him. His attention was on Grace. He stood slightly behind her, a silent guard, his position a clear statement of alliance. He was leaving this to her. And in that moment, Grace found her voice, a voice she had not used in years, clear and sharp as glass. "There is no prison here, Julian," she said, her eyes locked on his. "There is a contract, which I entered into with my eyes open. A contract my husband has honored in every particular." She took a small step forward. "Unlike you. You speak of honor, but you abandoned ours the moment my dowry disappeared. You speak of love, but you mean ownership. You have no claim on me. You have no purpose here. You should leave." For the first time in his life, Julian Croft was speechless. He looked from Grace's unyielding face to the silent, formidable Duke beside her, and the last of his blustering courage evaporated. He gave a curt, awkward bow and practically fled the room. When the door had closed behind him, the silence he left behind was profound. Grace stood, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. Alistair did not move. He simply stood beside her, a solid, reassuring presence in the quiet room. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "Well said, Duchess." And in his pale, wintry eyes, she saw something she had never seen before, a deep and unmistakable respect. That night, the library was not a refuge from sleeplessness, but a destination. Grace went there knowing he would be there, as if they had made an unspoken appointment. He was standing by the fire, one arm resting on the mantel, watching the flames. He looked up as she entered, and the charged silence from the morning room returned. But it was different now. The anger had dissipated, leaving a fragile, uncertain space between them. He gestured to the chair she always occupied. "Please." She sat, and he remained standing, a dark, thoughtful silhouette against the firelight. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The confrontation with Julian had shifted the very foundations of their arrangement. They had faced an external threat together, not as contractor and asset, but as allies. It was Alistair who finally broke the silence. "What I told you this afternoon was the truth," he said, his voice quiet. "But it was not the whole truth." He turned from the fire to face her, his expression stripped of its usual severity. He looked weary. "There was a reason I required a wife with no romantic notions, a reason I built this life of isolation." He told her then of his first marriage years ago, to a beautiful, celebrated society belle named Isabel. He had been young, and he had loved her, he thought. But she had loved his title and his fortune. She had conspired with his cousin to indebt the estate, passing information to his rivals, all while playing the part of the devoted wife. He had discovered the betrayal himself, finding their letters. The resulting scandal had been public and humiliating. His cousin had fled to the continent. Isabel had taken her own life. "After that," he said, his voice flat with remembered pain, "I closed this house. I closed myself. I vowed never to allow that kind of chaos, that vulnerability, into my life again. The contract with you, it was meant to be a fortress, a way to have what the title required without risking what I had lost." He looked at her, his gaze direct and raw. "I did not believe in trust until I watched you, day after day, year after year. I watched you bring order to this house. I watched you bring life back to that derelict garden. I watched you face down Thorne and the merchants, and today I watched you face down the past. You are the most honorable person I have ever known, Grace." Grace listened, and the last of her anger dissolved, replaced by a profound, aching understanding. The coldness, the distance, the closed wings of the house, they were not signs of his indifference, but scars from his wounds. He had been living in a fortress of his own making, and she, inadvertently, had been laying siege to it with nothing more than her quiet competence and steady presence. She thought of her own past, the casual cruelty of her family, the sting of Julian's betrayal. "I did not believe in safety," she said softly, meeting his gaze, "until I found it here." The admission hung in the air between them, simple and true. He moved from the fireplace and stopped before her chair. He looked down at her, and for the first time, he was not the formidable duke or the distant contractor. He was just a man, his defenses finally breached. He slowly reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently covered hers where they rested on the arm of the chair. His touch was warm and firm, a startling shock of contact after years of careful distance. It was the first time he had ever touched her. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. He did not need to. She could feel it in the strength of his grip, a silent confession that shook the foundations of their world. "The terms," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper, "are insufficient." A week later, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived on a silver tray. It was an invitation to the annual county assembly ball at Greystone, the pinnacle of the local social season. For 5 years, the invitation had been politely but firmly declined. It was a relic of a life Alistair had long since abandoned. Grace assumed this one would meet the same fate. She was in the newly organized estate office, formerly a disused parlor, when he came in, the invitation in his hand. He placed it on the desk before her. "It is time," he said, "that the county remembered it has a Duchess." He was not asking. He was making a statement. His eyes met hers, and she understood. This was not about society. This was about them. It was a public declaration, that the old terms were truly gone. "I will need a new gown," was all she said. He nodded. "I have already taken the liberty." 2 days later, a dressmaker arrived from London. The gown Alistair had commissioned was not what she would have expected. It was not a frivolous confection of lace and ruffles. It was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk, cut with an elegant, severe grace that highlighted the slender line of her neck and the intelligence in her eyes. It was a dress that spoke of authority and substance, not of decoration. When she looked at herself in the mirror on the night of the ball, she saw not Grace Ward, the discarded daughter, nor the phantom Duchess of Fenbridge. She saw a woman she was only just beginning to know. Their arrival at the Greystone Assembly Rooms caused a sensation. The music faltered for a moment as they were announced. A wave of whispers followed them as Alistair led her into the glittering, candlelit ballroom. The reclusive, monstrous Duke of Fenbridge and his wife, the woman no one had seen in 5 years. She could feel hundreds of eyes on them, dissecting her gown, her composure, her relationship with the formidable man at her side. He seemed oblivious to it all, his attention focused solely on her. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a simple, proprietary gesture that spoke volumes. They did not have to search for their antagonists. Julian Croft and her stepmother, Lady Ward, were holding court near the refreshment tables, their heads together, spreading their poison in carefully modulated whispers. Grace could almost hear the words, "prisoner, loveless, a fortune in exchange for her freedom." Lady Ward caught her eye and gave a small, malicious smile. Alistair saw it. Without a word, he led Grace toward the center of the floor just as the orchestra struck up the first waltz. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" he asked, his voice low and formal, but his eyes were warm. As he swept her into the dance, the rest of the room seemed to melt away. "They are watching," she murmured. "Let them," he replied, his hand firm in hers. "Tonight is for them to see the truth." He danced with a surprising, easy grace. For the first time, they were moving together in public, a united front. When the music ended, he did not lead her to the sidelines. Instead, he steered her directly toward a portly, important-looking man holding a glass of port. Lord Ashworth, the county's chief magistrate. "Ashworth," Alistair said, his voice carrying in the small lull. "I believe you have not had the pleasure of being formally introduced to my wife." Lord Ashworth bowed. "Duchess, an honor." "My wife has been occupied," Alistair continued, his tone conversational but clear enough for those nearby to overhear. "She has spent the last few years performing a miracle on the Fenbridge accounts, correcting years of mismanagement by my former steward, Mr. Thorne. Her acumen is remarkable. I find myself deeply in her debt." He then turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over to where Julian and Lady Ward stood, their smiles now frozen. Indeed, some of Thorne's financial irregularities were so concerning they required a full audit, which has uncovered some rather interesting connections to other local estates. The threat was unspoken, but perfectly clear. Social and financial ruin, delivered with a polite smile. Julian went pale. Lady Ward looked as if she had swallowed a wasp. The whispers around them changed their tune, from suspicion of Grace to admiration. In one clean, surgical strike, Alistair had not only defended her, but he had publicly named her value, her competence, her essential worth. The battle was over. They had won. The carriage ride home was cloaked in a new kind of silence. It was not the empty, echoing silence of their early years, nor the tense, charged silence of recent weeks. It was a warm, settled quiet. the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words. Alistair had taken her hand as they left the ballroom, and he did not release it. His thumb stroked gently over her knuckles, a simple, grounding touch that anchored her in the warm darkness of the carriage. Fenbridge Hall was ablaze with light, a welcoming beacon against the dark moorland. Mrs. Gable had clearly instructed the staff to light every lamp in the great hall. It no longer looked like a fortress, but a home. When they stepped inside, Alistair did not turn toward the east wing, nor did Grace turn toward the west. He kept her hand in his and led her to the base of the grand staircase. The single trunk that had stood by her door, a symbol of her intended departure, was gone. In its place, a vase of late-blooming roses from the garden filled the air with a soft, sweet fragrance. He stopped there, at the foot of the stairs that separated their two worlds, and turned to face her. The candlelight softened the hard angles of his face, warming the winter gray of his eyes. He lifted his free hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his touch feather-light. "Grace," he said, his voice low and rough. He looked at her, truly saw her, not as an asset or a duchess, but as the woman who had quietly, methodically dismantled every wall he had ever built. "I was wrong. For 5 years, I was wrong." He took a breath, the words coming with the weight of a lifetime of solitude behind them. "I do not require a duchess. I require a wife. My wife." He searched her eyes, his own vulnerable for the first time. "I love you." It was not a poetic declaration. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same certainty he would use to state his own name. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard. Tears she had not shed in years pricked at her eyes. She reached up, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "And I you, Alistair," she whispered. It was all that needed to be said. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion, but about homecoming. It was a quiet confirmation, a sealing of a new contract, one written not on paper, but on the heart. 6 months later, spring had come to Fenbridge. The moors were greening, and the air was soft with the promise of warmth. Grace and Alistair stood together in the rose garden. It was transformed. The crumbling trellises had been repaired, the paths cleared, and the bushes, pruned and tended with care, were covered in a riot of blooms, crimson, pink, and creamy white. The scent was intoxicating. They were working together, Alistair in his shirt sleeves, carefully staking a climbing rose while Grace snipped away deadheads. The house rose behind them, no longer a place of echoing silence. The windows of the east wing were open, letting in the fresh air. Laughter could sometimes be heard from the servants' hall. It was a house waking from a long sleep. Alistair finished his task and came to stand beside her, his arm sliding around her waist. She leaned her head against his shoulder, content. She thought of the contract he had dictated in his study all those years ago, a list of terms and conditions for a life of separate, cold civility. Every one of them had been broken. What had begun as a transaction had, through quiet observation, shared work, and unexpected honesty, become real. What was broken had been made whole. What was discarded had become essential. He lifted her left hand, his fingers tracing the simple gold band on her finger. It was the same ring from their cold, perfunctory ceremony. Then, it had been the symbol of a cage. Now, it was the symbol of a home. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, his eyes smiling into hers. Thank you for joining us on this journey to Fenbridge Hall. Did she make the right choice to stay that first night? Let us know your thoughts and where in the world you're watching from. Remember, love often arrives through whatever gaps we leave in our walls.